Hi, everybody. It is Wednesday, time for a word for today. As you know, we have been studying the 9 gifts of the Holy Spirit from 1 Corinthians chapter 12. Today, we are on gift number 8, which is recorded in verse 10, to another, different kinds of tongues, to another, the interpretation of tongues. So today we're going to look at different kinds of tongues, or many kinds of tongues. And next week we will conclude with the interpretation of tongues. Let me give you a definition from Dr. Bill Bright, who was for many years the head of Campus Crusade for Christ. The gift of tongues is the supernatural ability to speak to others and or to God in a language or utterance never learned by the speaker. So there are 2 approaches to tongues. Number 1, that the gift of tongues, when coupled with the gift of interpretation of tongues, is equal to the gift of prophecy. And I would say that is probably the most standard understanding of tongues. Number 2, the second approach suggests that tongues is expressing praise to God, and therefore any interpretation is also in terms of prayer, praise, or thanksgiving to God himself. The emphasis is that true tongues and interpretation of tongues are directed toward God rather than directed from God to the church. Here's a quote from the Phillips translation of 1 Corinthians 14, verse 2. The man who speaks in a tongue addresses not men, for no one understands a word he says, but God. And only in his spirit is he speaking spiritual secrets. And then from 1 Corinthians 14, verses 2 through 3 in the Amplified, it says, For one who speaks in an unknown tongue speaks not to men, but to God. For no one understands or catches his meaning, because in the Holy Spirit he utters secret truths and hidden things not obvious to the understanding. But on the other hand, the one who prophesies, who interprets the divine will and purpose in inspired preaching and teaching, speaks to men for their upbuilding and constructive spiritual progress and encouragement and consolation. So we understand that what Paul is saying about tongues is that no one understands what the person is saying, but he is speaking to God in this mysterious communication. On the day of Pentecost, the tongues spoken were interpreted as, we do hear them speak the wonderful works of God. That's in Acts 2, verse 11. It was Godward rather than manward. I believe the gift of tongues in 1 Corinthians 12 is different to the tongues we receive at our baptism in the Holy Spirit. That's a quote, and I would agree with that quote because the sign of being filled with the Holy Spirit, speaking with other tongues, is not for a public ministry, but rather it is an expression of praise to God. When I was first born again and part of a Pentecostal church, it was a common practice in Pentecostal services to have what we called a message in tongues, and then followed by an interpretation. And usually that was done by someone in one part of the church giving this message in tongues and another person giving the interpretation. And I would sit there as a young person and say, wow, God is speaking. And it's like, how do they know what is being said between each other? Except I understood this was a work of the Holy Spirit. Many times in these days, when someone speaks in tongues, they proceed immediately to interpret what they have just said. Some have said that these gifts are not for today. You've probably heard that if you've been around any length of time, because 1 Corinthians 13 says, when that which is in part, will be done away. And they believe that the Bible is what is the reason we don't need the gifts these days. But I have been blessed and helped through praying in the Spirit, in where I don't have my understanding, but the Holy Spirit is giving me a prayer burden, and tongues has become the language. It's a wonderful gift. I pray that all of us will seek to allow the Holy Spirit to flow through us in this gift. It blesses you and blesses the church. God bless your day.